Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Curtis Hicks stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chessboard waiting to be conquered. At 38, he had built Hicks Security Solutions from nothing into a multi-million-dollar private security firm that protected celebrities, politicians, and corporate executives. His reputation was built on two pillars: absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty to those who earned it. Curtis had learned early that trust was a currency more valuable than gold. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of South Chicago, he watched his father work 3 jobs to keep food on the table, only to have his mother run off with a smooth-talking salesman when Curtis was 12. The lesson was burned into his soul. Betrayal was the ultimate sin, and those who committed it deserved no mercy. "Mr. Hicks?" His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your wife is here to see you." A rare smile crossed Curtis's weathered face. Sandra Grace Hicks was the one person who had managed to penetrate his carefully constructed walls. They'd met 5 years ago at a charity gala where she was volunteering as an event coordinator. Unlike the other women who threw themselves at successful men, Sandra had been genuine, funny, and seemingly unimpressed by his wealth. She'd made him work for every smile, every laugh, every moment of her time. Sandra entered his office with a graceful confidence that had first caught his attention. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon light, and her emerald eyes sparkled with mischief. At 32, she still turned heads wherever she went, but Curtis had been the one to win her heart, or so he believed. "Busy day, Mr. Important?" she teased, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "Never too busy for you," Curtis replied, meaning every word. "What brings you downtown?" "I was shopping with your sister and thought I'd surprise you." Sandra's smile seemed forced, but Curtis attributed it to fatigue. "Geraldine mentioned you might be working late again tonight." Curtis nodded, already feeling the familiar pang of guilt. His work consumed him, but it was for Sandra and their future children. He'd been planning to propose for months, waiting for the perfect moment. The ring sat in his office safe, a 3-carat diamond that had cost more than most people made in a year. "How about we grab dinner tomorrow? That new place on 5th Street. Curtis suggested, already mentally rearranging his schedule. "I'd love that." Sandra's response came quickly, but her eyes darted to her phone as it buzzed. "Oh, that's Geraldine. I should run." After Sandra left, Curtis tried to focus on the quarterly reports spread across his desk, but something nagged at him. His sister Geraldine had been acting strange lately, avoiding his calls and giving short answers when they did speak. As someone who'd built a career on reading people, Curtis prided himself on noticing details others missed. Later that evening, Curtis's phone rang as he was leaving the office. The caller ID showed his brother-in-law Phil Ott, married to his younger sister Geraldine. "Curtis, I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" Phil's voice was strained, almost fearful. "What's wrong?" "Not over the phone. Just come over, please." The drive to Phil and Geraldine's suburban home took 40 minutes through traffic. Curtis found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his instincts screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. Phil met him at the door, his face pale and drawn. "Where's Geraldine?" Curtis asked immediately. She went to her book club." "Curtis, I don't know how to tell you this." Phil's hand shook as he poured 2 glasses of whiskey. "Maybe you should sit down." Curtis remained standing, his body coiled like a spring. "Just say it. It's about Sandra. I saw her." "Christ, Curtis, I saw her with another man. They were at the Morrison Hotel, and they weren't just talking." The words hit Curtis like physical blows. His vision narrowed, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "Tell me everything." Phil's story unfolded like a nightmare. He'd been meeting a client at the Morrison Hotel's restaurant when he'd seen Sandra in the elevator with a man Phil didn't recognize. Their body language was intimate, familiar. When Phil had discreetly followed, he'd watched them enter a room together. "I waited 2 hours," Phil continued, his voice barely above a whisper. They came out looking, well, like they'd been doing exactly what you'd think. Curtis felt something inside him snap, but his training kicked in. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when information was needed. Describe the man. Tall, probably 6'2", dark hair, expensive suit. Mid-30s, maybe. He walked like he was military or law enforcement. The description sent ice through Curtis's veins. It sounded like Damon Barker, a former FBI agent who'd started his own investigation firm 6 months ago. Curtis had met him at a professional conference, and they discussed potentially collaborating on cases that required both security and investigative expertise. Phil, I need you to promise me something. You don't tell anyone about this conversation. Not Geraldine, not anyone. Can you do that? Phil nodded quickly. Of course. Curtis, I'm sorry. I know how much you love her. Love. The word tasted like ash in Curtis's mouth. He'd loved Sandra with a devotion that bordered on worship, had been planning to give her everything he'd built, everything he was. But love, he learned long ago, was a weakness that others would exploit. I need to go, Curtis said, already moving toward the door. Remember what I said about keeping this quiet. As Curtis drove home, his mind began working with the cold precision that had made him successful. If Sandra was betraying him, she wasn't just breaking his heart. She was making a declaration of war. And wars, Curtis knew, were won by the side that was more ruthless, more prepared, and more willing to do whatever it took to achieve victory. He would need proof, evidence that would stand up in court when the time came. But more than that, he would need a plan that would make Sandra and her lover understand the true cost of betraying Curtis Hicks. Chapter 2. The Web of Deception. Curtis spent the next 3 days in a state of controlled fury, maintaining his normal routine while his mind churned with plans for investigation and revenge. His security firm had access to surveillance equipment that would make the FBI jealous, and he intended to use every resource at his disposal. The first step was confirmation. Despite Phil's eyewitness account, Curtis needed irrefutable proof before he could move forward. He installed a discreet GPS tracker on Sandra's car, tapped her phone with software that would make NSA technicians proud, and activated a network of contacts who owed him favors throughout the city. The evidence came faster than he'd expected. Sandra's movements painted a clear picture. Regular visits to the Morrison Hotel, always on days when Curtis would be working late. Phone records showed a pattern of calls to a number registered to Damon Barker's firm. Text messages, recovered through sophisticated software, were damning in their intimacy. But Curtis discovered something that made his blood freeze. The affair wasn't recent. It had been going on for over a year. Sandra had been playing the loving girlfriend while secretly meeting Barker almost weekly. Every shopping trip, every girl's night out, every excuse had been a carefully constructed lie. Even worse, Curtis found evidence that Sandra had been feeding information about his business to Barker. Client lists, security protocols, even details about his personal finances, all of it had been shared with her lover. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional espionage. On Thursday evening, Curtis sat in his home office, surrounded by printed emails, photographs, and financial records. His phone rang, and Sandra's face appeared on the screen, smiling at him from a photo taken during their vacation in Tuscany last year. Hey, honey. Her voice was warm, affectionate. I know you're working late, but I wanted to hear your voice. Hi, beautiful, Curtis replied, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. How was your day? Oh, boring stuff. I had lunch with Kathleen Jones from the charity board, then spent the afternoon at the spa. I'm exhausted. Curtis looked at the photograph on his desk, showing Sandra entering the Morrison Hotel at 2:47 p.m., her hand intertwined with Damon Barker's. The timestamp showed she'd been there for 3 hours. That sounds relaxing, he said. I should be home by 9. I'll wait up for you, Sandra purred. I've missed you. After ending the call, Curtis poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and began formulating his plan. Simple revenge wouldn't be enough. Sandra and Barker had conspired to betray him in the most fundamental way possible, and they would pay accordingly. The next morning, Curtis called his sister Geraldine, asking her to meet him for lunch. They sat in a quiet booth at an upscale restaurant, and Curtis studied his sister's face as she spoke about her volunteer work and Phil's recent promotion. "Geraldine," Curtis said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Her face paled slightly. "What is it? How long have you known about Sandra's affair?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Geraldine's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down, and Curtis had his answer before she spoke. "Curtis, How long, Geraldine?" His voice was quiet, but his sister recognized the tone. She'd heard it before, years ago, when someone had tried to cheat Curtis out of his first major business deal. 6 months, she whispered. "Maybe longer. I wanted to tell you, but Sandra begged me not to. She said it was over, that she was going to break it off." Curtis felt another piece of his heart turn to stone. His own sister had been part of the conspiracy, had looked him in the eye and lied for months. The betrayal was expanding, reaching into every corner of his life. "Who else knows? Just Phil and me. I swear, Curtis, I never wanted to hurt you. Sandra said you'd been distant, that you cared more about work than her." "Stop." Curtis's voice cut through her explanations like a blade. "Don't you dare try to justify this." Geraldine began to cry, but Curtis felt nothing. The woman across from him was no longer his sister. She was another enemy who had chosen sides in a war she didn't understand. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Curtis. I never meant for it to go this far." Curtis stood up, dropping a $50 bill on the table. "You made your choice, Geraldine. Live with it." That afternoon, Curtis received an unexpected visitor. Damon Barker stood in his office reception area, looking confident and relaxed. He was exactly as Phil had described, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mr. Hicks," Barker extended his hand. "I was hoping we could discuss some potential collaboration opportunities." Curtis shook the man's hand, noting the firm grip and steady eye contact. Barker was good at his job, Curtis had to admit. The man was standing in the office of the husband he was cuckolding, discussing business with perfect composure. "Of course," Curtis replied smoothly. "What did you have in mind?" For the next hour, Barker outlined several cases where their firms could work together. Corporate espionage investigations, executive protection with investigative support, even potential government contracts. The irony wasn't lost on Curtis. The man who was betraying him was also trying to profit from their association. "I think we could do great things together," Barker concluded. "I believe in building relationships based on trust and mutual benefit." Curtis smiled, and for a moment, Barker seemed unsettled by the expression. "Trust is indeed the foundation of any successful partnership, Mr. Barker. I've always believed that people who betray trust should face consequences." "Absolutely," Barker agreed, missing the subtle threat entirely. Disloyalty is a cancer that destroys everything it touches. After Barker left, Curtis made 3 phone calls. The first was to a contact in the district attorney's office, a man who owed Curtis several favors. The second was to a private investigator who specialized in cases that required flexible ethical standards. The third was to a number that wasn't listed in any directory, to a man who solved problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels. By evening, Curtis had assembled a team of professionals who would help him orchestrate the complete destruction of Sandra Grace and Damon Barker. But first, he needed to set the stage for the final act of this elaborate drama. Chapter 3. The Trap Springs. Curtis spent the weekend playing the role of the loving boyfriend with Oscar-worthy performance. He took Sandra to their favorite restaurant, bought her expensive jewelry, and made love to her with a passion that surprised even him. But beneath the surface, he was studying her like a lab specimen, cataloging every lie, every false smile, every moment of deception. On Monday morning, Curtis implemented the first phase of his plan. He called Sandra from his office, his voice filled with excitement. "Darling, I have incredible news. Remember that government contract I've been pursuing? The one for embassy security in Eastern Europe?" "Of course," Sandra replied, though Curtis could hear the distraction in her voice. She was probably texting Barker. "I got it. $20 million over 3 years. This is going to change everything for us." Curtis paused for effect. "I'm going to need someone I trust completely to help me manage the operational details. Someone who knows my business inside and out. Curtis, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you. There's more. I've been thinking about our future, about what we mean to each other. Sandra, I want to make this official. I want to make you my partner in every sense of the word. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. What do you mean? I mean marriage, Sandra. I want to marry you, and I want you to be my business partner. Full access to everything, complete transparency. We'll be a team in every way possible. Curtis could almost hear Sandra's mind racing. The prospect of marrying a man worth tens of millions while maintaining her affair with Barker would be too tempting to resist. She would see it as the ultimate victory, having both the financial security Curtis provided and the passion she found with her lover. Curtis, this is so sudden. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Say yes, Sandra. Say you'll marry me. Yes, she whispered, and Curtis could hear the tears in her voice. Real tears, which made her betrayal even more despicable. Yes, of course I'll marry you. That afternoon, Curtis met with his team in a secure conference room. The group included Luther Baker, a former military intelligence officer who now handled special projects, and Myron King, a cybersecurity expert who could manipulate digital evidence with surgical precision. Gentlemen, Curtis began, I need you to understand that what we're about to do operates in several gray areas of the law. Anyone who's uncomfortable with that can leave now with full payment and no questions asked. No one moved. Good. Here's what we're going to do. In 3 days, I'm hosting an engagement party at my house. Sandra and Damon Barker will both be there, along with approximately 50 other guests. During that party, certain revelations will come to light that will destroy both of them completely. Curtis outlined his plan in detail. Luther would handle the physical aspects, while Myron would manage the digital evidence. Other team members would ensure that key witnesses were in place and that law enforcement arrived at precisely the right moment. What about your sister? Luther asked. She's been part of the deception. Curtis's expression hardened. Geraldine made her choice when she decided to help Sandra lie to me. She'll face the consequences along with the rest of them. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Curtis arranged for Sandra to spend the afternoon at an exclusive spa while he handled the party preparations. In reality, he was supervising the installation of hidden cameras throughout his house and ensuring that every conversation would be recorded in high-definition clarity. Sandra returned home that evening glowing with excitement, babbling about wedding plans and their future together. Curtis listened with the detached interest of a scientist observing a fascinating but ultimately doomed specimen. I invited Damon Barker to the party, Sandra mentioned casually as they prepared for bed. I hope that's okay. I thought it might be good for your business relationship. Of course, Curtis replied. The more the merrier. Sandra smiled and kissed him goodnight, her lips soft and warm against his. Curtis wondered if she felt any guilt at all, or if the capacity for remorse had been bred out of her entirely. The morning of the party, Curtis woke before dawn and went to his home office. He opened his safe and removed the engagement ring he'd bought months ago, holding it up to the light. 3 carats of perfect clarity, set in platinum, worth more than most people's cars. He'd imagined sliding it on his Sandra's finger, seeing her face light up with joy and love. Instead, he placed it in a small velvet box and put it in his jacket pocket. It would serve a different purpose now. By evening, Curtis's house was filled with guests. Business associates, old friends, family members, all gathered to celebrate what they believed was a joyous occasion. Sandra wore a stunning red dress that hugged her curves perfectly, playing the role of the radiant bride-to-be with masterful precision. Damon Barker arrived at 8 o'clock, looking handsome and confident. He congratulated Curtis with apparent sincerity, shook hands with Sandra as if they were casual acquaintances, and mingled with the other guests with practiced ease. At 9:30, Curtis called for everyone's attention. He stood in the center of his living room, Sandra at his side, holding a glass of champagne. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began, his voice carrying easily through the room. You're here to celebrate my engagement to Sandra, but before we make this official, I want to share something with all of you. Curtis reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. You see, I've recently discovered some very interesting information about trust, loyalty, and the true nature of the people we think we know. Sandra's face began to pale, but she maintained her smile. Across the room, Damon Barker straightened slightly, his police training kicking in. For the past year, Curtis continued, I've been betrayed by someone I trusted completely. Someone who took my love, my faith, and my loyalty, and threw it all away for a quick thrill with another man. The room fell silent. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Curtis opened the envelope and pulled out a series of photographs. High-resolution images of Sandra and Damon entering hotel rooms, kissing in parking garages, holding hands in restaurants across the city. Ladies and gentlemen, Curtis announced, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever, I present to you Sandra Grace and Damon Barker, who have been conducting an affair for over a year while Sandra pretended to love me. The explosion of gasps and murmurs filled the room. Sandra's face went white, and she reached for Curtis's arm, but he stepped away from her. Curtis, please let me explain. Oh, you'll have plenty of time to explain, Curtis said calmly. You see, Sandra, your lover, Mr. Barker, isn't just an adulterer. He's also a criminal. Curtis nodded to Luther, who stepped forward with another envelope. While conducting surveillance on Mr. Barker, my team discovered something interesting. He's been using his investigative firm to run an identity theft operation, stealing personal information from his clients and selling it to organized crime families. Damon Barker's face went from confused to terrified in seconds. That's not true. Curtis, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but the FBI will be very interested in the evidence we've compiled, Curtis continued relentlessly. Bank records, encrypted communications, even recorded conversations with known criminals. It's all very thoroughly documented. In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder as they approached the house. Curtis had timed everything perfectly. But wait, he said, pulling out the velvet ring box. There's more. Sandra, my dear, sweet Sandra, I know you've been providing Mr. Barker with classified information about my clients. Corporate espionage is a federal crime, punishable by up to 20 years in prison. Sandra collapsed into a chair, her perfect facade finally cracking. Curtis, please, I love you. I made a mistake, but I love you. Love. Curtis's voice was like ice. You don't know the meaning of the word. The siren stopped outside, and Curtis could see flashing red and blue lights through his windows. Federal agents would be at his door within minutes, armed with warrants for both Sandra and Damon's arrest. There's one more thing, Curtis said, turning to address the room. My sister Geraldine has been helping Sandra cover up this affair for months. She chose to betray her own brother for a woman who was using both of us. Geraldine, who had been standing near the kitchen, burst into tears. Curtis, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't repair broken trust, Geraldine. Sorry doesn't undo betrayal. The doorbell rang, and Curtis walked calmly to answer it. 6 federal agents stood on his porch, their faces stern and professional. Curtis had provided them with enough evidence to ensure that both Sandra and Damon would face serious federal charges. As the agents entered his house and began reading Sandra and Damon their rights, Curtis felt a cold satisfaction wash over him. This was justice, not just revenge. They had declared war on him, and now they would face the consequences. Sandra looked at him one last time as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Curtis, please. I know I hurt you, but this is too much. I'm begging you. Curtis stared at her with eyes that held no warmth, no forgiveness, no trace of the love he'd once felt. You made your choice, Sandra. Now live with it. As the agents led Sandra and Damon away, Curtis turned to face his remaining guests. Some looked horrified, others impressed, but all of them understood one thing. Curtis Hicks was not a man to be crossed. The party was over, but Curtis's work was just beginning. This was only the first phase of his revenge, and he intended to make sure that everyone who had betrayed him would pay the full price for their treachery. Chapter 4. The Reckoning Begins. 3 weeks after the arrests, Curtis sat in his lawyer's office reviewing the legal proceedings that would seal Sandra and Damon's fate. The federal prosecutors had been more than happy to work with Curtis, especially given the quality of evidence his team had provided. The identity theft charges against Barker are solid, his attorney, Ricardo Randolph, explained. 15 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of identity theft, and conspiracy charges. He's looking at 25 to 30 years minimum. Curtis nodded with satisfaction. The evidence against Barker had been meticulously crafted by his team, woven together with just enough real criminal activity to make the fabricated elements undetectable. Barker had been sloppy in his real business dealings, providing the perfect foundation for Curtis's more elaborate frame job. And Sandra. The corporate espionage charges are more complex, but given the classified nature of your client information and the evidence of her passing it to Barker, she's facing 10 to 15 years. The prosecutors are particularly interested in the national security implications. Curtis had been careful to ensure that Sandra's crimes were real, even if her motivations had been manipulated. She had indeed shared confidential client information with Barker, ostensibly for their personal relationship, but legally constituting espionage. The fact that Curtis had guided her into these actions through careful manipulation was irrelevant to the courts. Have either of them attempted to contact me? Both have tried multiple times through their attorneys. Barker claims he's been framed, and Sandra. Ricardo paused, consulting his notes. Sandra wants to speak with you personally. She says she has information that could help your business. Curtis smiled coldly. Even facing decades in prison, Sandra was still trying to manipulate him. Tell both attorneys that I have no interest in any communication with their clients. My testimony will be limited to what's required by law. After leaving the lawyer's office, Curtis drove to his sister Geraldine's house. She'd been calling him daily since the arrests, but he'd ignored every attempt at communication. Today, however, he had a purpose for seeing her. Phil answered the door, his face haggard and drawn. Curtis, thank God you're here. Geraldine's been. She's not taking any of this well. Curtis followed Phil into the living room, where Geraldine sat curled in a chair, staring at nothing. She looked up when he entered, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. Curtis, please, she whispered. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I'm your sister. We're family. Family doesn't lie to each other, Geraldine. Family doesn't help outsiders betray their own blood. I was trying to protect you. Sandra said you'd be devastated if you found out, that it would destroy you. So you decided to let me continue living a lie? Curtis's voice was perfectly controlled, but the anger beneath it was volcanic. You watched me plan a future with a woman who was betraying me, and you said nothing. Geraldine began to cry again, but Curtis felt nothing. The woman in front of him was no longer his sister. She was another enemy who had chosen the wrong side. I'm cutting all ties with you, Geraldine. You're no longer my sister, and I'm no longer your brother. Don't contact me again. Curtis, you can't mean that. We're family. We're all the family each other has. Curtis turned to Phil, who was standing in the doorway, looking stricken. Phil, I genuinely liked you. You tried to do the right thing by telling me the truth. But you're married to her, which makes you my enemy by association. Curtis, please. If either of you comes near me, my home, or my business, I'll have you arrested for harassment. If you try to contact me through third parties, I'll make your lives very difficult in ways you can't imagine. Curtis left without another word, closing the door on his past and the people who had betrayed him. The Hicks family line would die with him, but that was preferable to maintaining relationships with people who had proven their disloyalty. The next phase of his plan required patience and careful timing. Curtis had studied Sandra and Damon's psychological profiles extensively, and he knew that their imprisonment was only the beginning of their punishment. True justice required something more personal, more devastating than mere incarceration. 2 months into their prison sentences, Curtis received word that Sandra had been placed in protective custody after several violent incidents with other inmates. Female prisoners, he'd learned, had little tolerance for women who betrayed their men. Damon, meanwhile, had been transferred to a maximum security facility after being attacked by inmates who didn't appreciate former law enforcement officers. Curtis felt a deep satisfaction knowing that both of them were suffering, but he wasn't finished. Using his extensive network of contacts, he began to orchestrate a more subtle form of torment. Anonymous letters began arriving at the prison, each one containing photographs of Sandra and Damon together, along with detailed descriptions of their betrayal. Other inmates learned about their crimes through carefully planted information. Their commissary accounts were mysteriously emptied. Legal documents were lost or misfiled, delaying appeals and parole hearings. Curtis also ensured that their families faced consequences. Damon's elderly mother found herself under IRS investigation for tax irregularities that Curtis's team had carefully documented. Sandra's younger brother lost his job when his employer received anonymous tips about his association with a federal criminal. The web of revenge spread outward, touching everyone who had been connected to the betrayal. Curtis's resources were vast, and his patience was infinite. He would spend years, even decades, ensuring that Sandra and Damon's punishment continued long after their prison sentences ended. But the most satisfying revenge was yet to come. Curtis had learned that Sandra was pregnant, a fact that the prison medical staff had discovered during routine testing. The father was almost certainly Damon, though Curtis supposed it could have been him. Either way, the child would grow up knowing that both parents were federal criminals who had betrayed the one man who had truly loved them. Curtis arranged for the child to be placed in an adoption agency that he secretly controlled. The adoptive parents would be good people, but they would never know the truth about the child's origins. Sandra would spend the rest of her life knowing that her child was out there somewhere, being raised by strangers, while she rotted in prison for her crimes. As Curtis sat in his office that evening, he reflected on the events of the past year. He had lost everything that mattered to him: his wife-to-be, his sister, his faith in human decency. But he had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that betrayal came with a price, and that price would be paid in full. The intercom buzzed, and his secretary's voice filled the room. "Mr. Hicks, there's a young woman here to see you. She says her name is Lee Shoemaker, and she's here about a security position." Curtis smiled for the first time in months. Life would go on, and perhaps there would be room for someone new in his carefully controlled world. But this time, he would be more careful about whom he trusted. The lessons of betrayal had been learned, and they would never be forgotten. Chapter 5. The Deeper Game. 6 months after Sandra and Damon's convictions, Curtis received an unexpected visitor that would change everything. He was reviewing quarterly reports when his secretary announced that a federal agent was requesting an immediate meeting. Agent Monique Stark was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an all-business demeanor. She entered Curtis's office carrying a thick briefcase and wearing an expression that immediately put him on high alert. "Mr. Hicks, I'm Agent Stark with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. I need to discuss some concerning information that's come to light during our investigation of Damon Barker." Curtis maintained his composure, though his mind began racing through possibilities. "Of course, Agent Stark. How can I help?" "During our investigation of Mr. Barker's identity theft operation, we discovered something troubling. It appears that you and your security firm were among his targets." Curtis felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Agent Stark opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Barker had been systematically gathering information about your clients, your business operations, and your personal finances for over 18 months. We found detailed dossiers on your most sensitive clients, including several who work in classified government positions." The implications hit Curtis like a sledgehammer. If Barker had been investigating him professionally, their entire relationship, including Sandra's affair, might have been orchestrated as part of a larger operation. "Agent Stark, I provided the evidence that led to Barker's arrest. Are you suggesting that I was somehow involved in his crimes?" "Not at all, Mr. Hicks. We believe you were the target, not the perpetrator. But we need to understand how deep this goes. The information Barker compiled could have compromised national security." Curtis's mind raced through the implications. If Sandra's affair had been part of a larger intelligence operation, then everything he thought he knew about the betrayal was wrong. The personal devastation he'd felt might have been engineered by professionals who saw him as a target rather than a victim. What kind of information did Barker have? "Details about your security protocols, client lists, even your personal habits and psychological profile." Someone was paying him to compile a comprehensive intelligence package on you and your organization. Agent Stark spread several documents across Curtis's desk. The level of detail was staggering. Financial records, psychological assessments, even photographs of his daily routines taken with telephoto lenses. Who was paying him? That's what we're trying to determine. The money was routed through several shell companies, ultimately traced back to offshore accounts. We believe it was foreign intelligence, but we need your help to identify who might see you as a target. Curtis studied the documents, his anger building with each revelation. He'd been played on a level he hadn't even imagined. Sandra's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional espionage of the highest order. Given the nature of your clients, Agent Starr continued, we believe you may have been targeted by multiple foreign intelligence services. Your security firm protects people who have access to classified information, military secrets, and sensitive government operations. You're saying Sandra was a foreign agent? We don't know yet. She may have been an unwitting asset, recruited by Barker and manipulated into providing information. Or she may have been a professional operative from the beginning. That's what we need to find out. Curtis felt his world tilting on its axis. Everything he believed about Sandra, about their relationship, about the betrayal, all of it might have been an elaborate intelligence operation designed to compromise him and his clients. What do you need from me? Full cooperation. We need access to your security protocols, your client communications, and any information you might have about how Sandra and Barker operated. We also need you to be extremely careful about your personal security. If foreign intelligence services are involved, you could be in physical danger. After Agent Stark left, Curtis sat alone in his office, staring at the documents spread across his desk. His carefully planned revenge suddenly seemed naive and small-scale compared to the larger game being played around him. His phone rang, and the caller ID showed his private investigator, Luther Baker. Curtis, we need to talk. I've been digging deeper into Sandra's background, and I found something that doesn't add up. What is it? Sandra Grace isn't her real name. Her birth certificate, her college records, even her social security number, they're all fabricated. Professional-grade identity creation, the kind that requires government-level resources. Curtis felt the pieces clicking into place. How long has she been using this identity? At least 7 years, maybe longer. Whoever created Sandra Grace did a masterful job. She has a complete life history, financial records, even social media accounts that go back years. This is an amateur hour, Curtis. This is professional intelligence work. Curtis's hands clenched into fists. He'd been manipulated by professionals who had studied him, learned his weaknesses, and deployed Sandra like a weapon against him. The woman he'd loved had never existed. She was a carefully constructed lie designed to destroy him. Luther, I want you to dig deeper. I want to know everything about who Sandra really is, who sent her, and what they wanted from me. Use every resource we have. Already on it. But Curtis, if foreign intelligence is involved, this goes way beyond what we can handle alone. These people don't just ruin lives, they eliminate threats. After ending the call, Curtis walked to his window and stared out at the city below. Everything had changed in the span of a single conversation. His personal revenge against Sandra and Damon now seemed like a sideshow compared to the larger threat he faced. But Curtis Hicks hadn't built a security empire by backing down from dangerous situations. If foreign operatives wanted to play games with him, he would show them what a truly ruthless opponent looked like. Chapter 6. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. The revelation that Sandra was a foreign operative fundamentally changed Curtis's approach to revenge. This was no longer about a cheating girlfriend and her lover. This was about national security, professional survival, and the complete destruction of an intelligence network that had targeted him. Curtis spent the next week reviewing every interaction he'd had with Sandra, looking for clues he'd missed. Luther's team had compiled a comprehensive analysis of her activities, and the picture that emerged was chilling in its sophistication. Sandra had been placed in Curtis's path through a carefully orchestrated series of coincidences. The charity gala where they'd met hadn't been random. She'd been volunteering there specifically to encounter him. Her resistance to his advances, which he'd found so attractive, had been calculated to make him pursue her more aggressively. She played you perfectly, Luther reported during their morning briefing. Every conversation, every intimate moment, every shared experience was designed to gather intelligence about your operations. Curtis studied the psychological profile his team had developed. Sandra had been trained to identify and exploit emotional vulnerabilities. His well-known loyalty to family had been used against him through Geraldine. His need for trust had been weaponized to make him share confidential information. What about Damon Barker? Barker's real, but he was recruited by Sandra, not the other way around. She seduced him and convinced him to help gather intelligence. He thought he was involved in corporate espionage for financial gain, not realizing he was working for foreign intelligence. Curtis felt a grudging respect for the operation's complexity. Sandra had managed two separate relationships, maintaining perfect operational security while gathering massive amounts of sensitive information. She was a professional of the highest caliber. Have we identified which country she's working for? Still working on it, but the evidence points to a consortium of Eastern European intelligence services. They're particularly interested in your government clients, the defense contractors, the intelligence officials, the politicians you've provided security for. Curtis's client list read like a who's who of American national security. Senators, generals, CIA officials, defense industry executives. All of them have been potentially compromised through his relationship with Sandra. That afternoon, Curtis received another visit from Agent Stark, this time accompanied by a man who introduced himself only as Director Phillips from an unnamed government agency. "Mr. Hicks," Phillips began, "we need to discuss the extent of the intelligence breach you've suffered. Some of your clients are involved in programs that could compromise national security if their information has been leaked." Curtis spread his hands. "Gentlemen, I've provided full cooperation with your investigation. What more do you need? We need you to help us turn this situation to our advantage," Agent Stark explained. "Sandra Grace, or whatever her real name is, doesn't know that we've uncovered her true identity. As far as she knows, she's in prison for corporate espionage, not espionage against the United States." Phillips leaned forward. "We want you to make contact with her. Convince her that you've forgiven her, that you want to help with her legal defense. We need to identify her handlers and learn the full scope of what she's compromised." Curtis considered the proposal. Using his access to Sandra to gather intelligence was appealing, but it would require him to suppress his desire for immediate revenge in favor of a longer-term strategy. "What's in it for me?" "Complete immunity from any charges related to the intelligence breach, plus full government protection for you and your business," Phillips replied. "We'll also ensure that Sandra and her entire network face the full consequences of their actions." Curtis smiled coldly. "That's a start, but I want more. I want the resources to hunt down everyone involved in this operation. I want them to pay for targeting me, and I want their suffering to be comprehensive and permanent." The two agents exchanged glances. "Mr. Hicks, we're talking about intelligence professionals backed by foreign governments. This isn't a corporate dispute that can be resolved through legal channels." "I'm not talking about legal channels," Curtis replied quietly. "I'm talking about the kind of justice that people like Sandra understand, the kind that makes examples out of those who betray trust." Director Phillips studied Curtis carefully. "You're proposing to wage a personal war against an intelligence network. I'm proposing to eliminate a threat to American national security while satisfying my own need for justice. Sometimes personal and professional interests align perfectly." After a long pause, Phillips nodded. "We can work with that, Mr. Hicks, but you'll be operating under our oversight, and you'll follow our rules." Curtis's smile widened. "Director Phillips, I think you'll find that my rules and your objectives are perfectly compatible." The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Curtis would visit Sandra in prison, playing the role of the heartbroken lover seeking closure. He would gradually convince her that he still cared for her, that he wanted to help with her legal defense, and that he was willing to forgive her betrayal. Once Sandra trusted him again, Curtis would use that trust to identify her handlers, learn about other operations she'd been involved in, and gather intelligence about the broader network that had targeted him. But Curtis had no intention of limiting himself to gathering intelligence. Every person involved in Sandra's operation would face personal consequences that went far beyond legal prosecution. He would destroy their lives, their families, and their future prospects with the same systematic thoroughness they had used against him. The game had changed, but Curtis Hicks was still playing to win. And this time, he had the full resources of the United States government backing his quest for revenge. Chapter 7. The Manipulation. Curtis's first visit to Sandra in federal prison was carefully choreographed. He dressed casually, wore a melancholy expression, and carried himself like a man struggling with profound heartbreak. The performance began the moment he entered the visiting room. Sandra looked smaller in her prison uniform, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup. When she saw Curtis, her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he almost believed her emotion was genuine. "Curtis," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't think you'd ever want to see me again." Curtis sat across from her, maintaining the perfect balance between hurt and lingering affection. "I didn't want to come. My lawyer advised against it. But I needed to understand why, Sandra. I needed to hear it from you." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation on both sides. Sandra played the role of the remorseful woman who had made a terrible mistake, while Curtis portrayed himself as the wounded lover seeking closure. "I loved you, Curtis. I still love you. What happened with Damon, it was a moment of weakness that spiraled out of control. I never meant for it to go so far." Curtis leaned forward slightly, his voice soft with manufactured pain. "But it wasn't just an affair, Sandra. You shared information about my business, about my clients. That wasn't a moment of weakness. That was a betrayal of everything I trusted you with." Sandra's tears seemed genuine as she reached across the table toward his hands. "I was trying to help Damon with his investigation business. I thought if I could provide him with some general information, it would help him succeed, and then maybe I could convince him to end our relationship. I know it sounds crazy, but I was trying to find a way back to you." The lie was expertly crafted, containing just enough truth to be believable while obscuring the real purpose of her espionage. Curtis had to admit that Sandra was exceptionally skilled at her craft. "Sandra, the federal prosecutors are saying you could face 15 years in prison. Your lawyer has been calling my office, suggesting that I could testify on your behalf as a character witness." Hope flickered in Sandra's eyes. "Would you consider it?" "Curtis, I know I don't deserve your help, but—" "I don't know," Curtis interrupted, playing his role perfectly. "The woman I loved wouldn't have betrayed me like this. I'm not sure who you really are anymore." Over the next several visits, Curtis carefully rebuilt Sandra's trust while gathering crucial intelligence. She revealed details about how she had first been approached by someone claiming to be a freelance intelligence broker. The man had convinced her that corporate espionage was common in high-level business relationships, and that providing information about Curtis's clients would be financially lucrative for both of them. His name was Neil Malone, Sandra confided during their fourth visit. He said he worked for private security firms that needed competitive intelligence. He made it sound so legitimate, so normal. Curtis memorized every detail Sandra provided about Neil Malone, passing the information to his government handlers while privately planning his own response. Malone was the key to unraveling the entire network, and Curtis intended to personally ensure that he faced consequences for orchestrating the operation. "Sandra," Curtis said during their sixth visit, "I've been thinking about what you've told me, about how you were manipulated into this situation. Maybe you were as much a victim as I was." The relief on Sandra's face was palpable. "Curtis, do you really think so? I've been torturing myself, thinking about what I did to you, to us. I'm going to talk to my lawyer about testifying on your behalf," Curtis said, taking her hands in his. "But I need you to tell me everything about Neil Malone and anyone else who was involved. If you were manipulated, we need to prove it." Sandra's cooperation increased dramatically as she began to believe that Curtis might actually help her avoid a lengthy prison sentence. She provided detailed descriptions of her handlers, their methods of communication, and the specific information they had requested about Curtis's clients. But as Curtis gathered intelligence, he was also laying the groundwork for a more personal form of justice. Using his extensive network of contacts, he began to identify and track down every person involved in the operation against him. Neil Malone, it turned out, was a former CIA operative who had gone freelance after being forced out of the agency for ethical violations. He maintained residences in 3 different countries and operated under multiple identities. Through careful investigation, Curtis also identified 2 other operatives who had been involved in gathering intelligence about his business. Renee O'Neill, a computer specialist who had hacked his systems, and Joey Foley, a surveillance expert who had coordinated the physical observation of Curtis's daily routines. Each of these men had families, business interests, and personal vulnerabilities that Curtis's team cataloged with methodical precision. When the time came for revenge, Curtis would be able to strike at them in ways that would cause maximum suffering and lasting damage. The beauty of their situation, Curtis explained to Luther during one of their planning sessions, is that they can't go to law enforcement for protection. They're foreign intelligence operatives who have committed crimes against the United States. They're on their own. Luther studied the photographs and dossiers spread across Curtis's desk. These are dangerous people, Curtis. They won't just accept whatever punishment you have in mind. I'm counting on it, Curtis replied with a cold smile. I want them to fight back. I want them to escalate, because every action they take against me will justify everything I do to them. Curtis's plan was entering its final phase. He had gathered enough intelligence to satisfy his government handlers, and he had identified every person involved in the operation against him. Soon, Sandra and her handlers would learn what it meant to target Curtis Hicks. The war they had started was about to end, but not in the way they had anticipated. Chapter 8, The Final Gambit. Curtis's 8th visit to Sandra came 3 months after their first reunion. By now, she trusted him completely, believing that he was working with her attorneys to secure a reduced sentence. In reality, Curtis had been feeding information to federal prosecutors that would ensure she faced the maximum penalty for espionage. Curtis, I have something important to tell you, Sandra said, her eyes bright with hope. My lawyer thinks we might be able to plea bargain down to 5 years if you testify about how I was manipulated by Neil Malone. Curtis nodded sympathetically while internally savoring the irony. Sandra still believed she was facing corporate espionage charges, unaware that federal investigators had reclassified her crimes as espionage against the United States, which carried a potential life sentence. Sandra, before I commit to testifying, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Of course. I've told you everything. Curtis leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Is Sandra Grace your real name? For just a moment, Sandra's composure cracked. The trained operative behind the girlfriend's mask flickered into view before she recovered her performance. What do you mean? Of course it's my real name. Because I've been having trouble sleeping, thinking about our relationship, and I started looking into your background more carefully. Some things don't add up, Sandra. Your college records, your employment history. There are gaps that don't make sense. Sandra's face paled, but she maintained her act. Curtis, I don't understand what you're suggesting. Why would I lie about my identity? Curtis studied her face with the cold analysis of a predator evaluating prey. I think you know exactly what I'm suggesting. I think Sandra Grace is a carefully constructed identity, and I think everything about our relationship was planned from the beginning. The mask finally slipped completely. Sandra's posture changed, her expression hardened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a subtle accent that Curtis had never heard before. You're more perceptive than my superiors gave you credit for, she said quietly. But it doesn't matter what you think you know. I'm facing corporate espionage charges, nothing more. Curtis smiled, and Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his expression that she recognized from her training, the look of someone who held all the cards and was about to play them. Sandra, or whatever your real name is, you're not facing corporate espionage charges. You're facing charges under the Espionage Act. The federal government knows exactly who you are and who you work for. The color drained from Sandra's face. That's impossible. Is it? Did you really think I was stupid enough to fall for your act twice? Every conversation we've had in this room has been recorded. Every piece of information you've given me about Neil Malone and your handlers has been passed directly to federal intelligence agencies. Sandra sat back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. If Curtis was telling the truth, she wasn't just facing a long prison sentence. She was facing life imprisonment or potentially even execution for treason. "You used me," she whispered. Curtis's laugh was devoid of warmth. "I used you? Sandra, you spent 2 years of your life pretending to love me while stealing classified information that could have endangered American lives. You manipulated me, lied to me, and betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. And now you're upset because I turned the tables on you. Curtis, please." "Oh, I'm not finished yet," Curtis continued relentlessly. "While you've been sitting in here telling me about Neil Malone and your other associates, my people have been hunting them down. Malone is currently in a federal detention facility in Virginia, facing charges that will put him away for the rest of his life. Renee O'Neill was arrested in Budapest 3 days ago and is being extradited. Joey Foley. Well, Joey had an unfortunate accident in Prague that left him permanently disabled." Sandra's eyes widened in horror. "You had him attacked?" "I had him neutralized as a threat to American national security," Curtis corrected. "The difference is important from a legal standpoint. You can't do this. There are laws, international agreements." Curtis leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Sandra, you declared war on me when you walked into my life with orders to destroy it. You targeted my business, my clients, and my country. Did you really think I would just accept that quietly? What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand the full scope of what you've lost," Curtis replied. "Your real identity is Sylvia Holloway, born in Prague 34 years ago. You were recruited by Czech intelligence when you were 19 and have been operating in the United States for over a decade. Your handlers have been feeding information to Russian intelligence services, which means you are guilty of treason against the country that welcomed you." Sandra, Sylvia, stared at him in shock. The level of intelligence Curtis had gathered about her true identity was staggering. "Your parents in Prague have been arrested on suspicion of espionage. Your younger brother has been expelled from university and blacklisted from employment. Your handlers have either been captured or eliminated. The entire network you were part of has been systematically destroyed." Tears began streaming down Sylvia's face as the full magnitude of Curtis's revenge became clear. He hadn't just targeted her. He had destroyed everyone and everything connected to her operation. "But that's still not enough," Curtis continued. "You see, Sylvia, you made the mistake of trying to manipulate someone who doesn't forgive and doesn't forget. You thought you could play with my emotions, steal my secrets, and disappear back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Curtis stood up, preparing to leave. "You're going to spend the rest of your life in an American supermax prison, knowing that everyone you ever cared about has been destroyed because of your actions. And every day for the rest of your life, you're going to remember that Curtis Hicks kept his promise to make you pay for betraying him." As Curtis walked toward the exit, Sylvia called out desperately, "Curtis, wait. I can give you information about other operations, other agents." Curtis stopped and turned back to her. "Sylvia, I already have all the information I need. And frankly, I don't care about other operations. I only cared about the one that targeted me." He walked to the door, then paused one final time. "Oh, and Sylvia, the child you're carrying? The adoption has been arranged through an agency I control. The adoptive parents are good people who will raise him or her to be a loyal American citizen. Your bloodline will serve the country you tried to betray." The sound of Sylvia's anguished scream followed Curtis as he left the prison for the last time. Phase 1 of his revenge was complete, but the war was far from over. Neil Malone and the remaining members of the network were still breathing, and Curtis intended to correct that oversight. Chapter 9. The Reckoning Complete. 6 months later, Curtis sat in his office reading the final intelligence report on Operation Comeuppance, the codename the government had given to his systematic destruction of the espionage network. Every loose end had been tied up, every enemy neutralized, every threat eliminated. Neil Malone had been found dead in his federal detention cell, an apparent suicide by hanging. Curtis's contact in the prison system had ensured that Malone's final days were spent in constant fear, surrounded by inmates who had been carefully informed about his crimes against American service members. Rene O'Neill had suffered a different fate after his extradition to the United States. During transport from the airport, the convoy carrying him had been ambushed by unknown assailants. O'Neill's body was found 3 days later in a remote forest, bearing signs of extensive torture before his execution. The surviving members of the Czech intelligence cell that had targeted Curtis had either been arrested in coordinated raids across Europe or had simply disappeared. Those who remained alive faced decades in prison, their careers destroyed and their families disgraced. But Curtis's most satisfying victory was personal. His former sister Geraldine had finally understood the true cost of betraying family loyalty. Unable to cope with the social ostracism and financial pressure Curtis had orchestrated, she and Phil had lost their home, their savings, and their marriage. Geraldine now worked as a clerk in a discount store, living in a one-bedroom apartment and struggling to pay for basic necessities. The final intelligence assessment confirms that the entire network has been eliminated, Director Phillips reported during their concluding meeting. Your cooperation has been invaluable to national security, Mr. Hicks. Curtis accepted the government's gratitude with appropriate modesty, but privately he knew that national security had been a secondary concern. His primary objective had always been personal revenge, and on that front, his success had been total. Sylvia Holloway, he refused to think of her as Sandra anymore, had been sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The child she had carried was born in the prison medical facility and immediately placed with the adoptive family Curtis had selected. The boy would grow up as an American citizen, never knowing that his biological mother was a foreign spy who had betrayed the country of his birth. Curtis's business had not only survived the intelligence breach, but had grown stronger. His cooperation with federal agencies had earned him exclusive contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Politicians, generals, and intelligence officials competed for his services, knowing that Curtis Hicks was a man who could be trusted to protect America's secrets. But the most important change was in Curtis himself. The man who had once believed in love, family, and the basic goodness of human nature no longer existed. In his place stood someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who understood that trust was a luxury he could never again afford. Curtis had learned to find satisfaction in solitude, to derive pleasure from the systematic destruction of his enemies, and to sleep peacefully knowing that anyone who betrayed him would face consequences that extended far beyond legal punishment. His phone buzzed with a text message from Daisy Clifford, a former military intelligence officer who had recently joined his firm. She was intelligent, capable, and beautiful. Everything Curtis might once have found attractive in a partner. But romance was a weakness he had eliminated from his life, along with trust and forgiveness. Curtis deleted the message without responding and returned to his work. There were contracts to review, threats to assess, and enemies to monitor. Somewhere in the world, other operatives were planning operations against American interests, and Curtis would be ready for them. He had become something that his enemies feared and his allies respected. A man without mercy, without sentiment, and without the vulnerabilities that had once made him a target. The price of that transformation had been everything he had once held dear, but Curtis considered it a fair trade. The war that had begun with Sandra's betrayal was finally over, and Curtis Hicks had won completely. His enemies were dead, imprisoned, or broken. His reputation was unassailable. His future was secure, and if that future would be spent alone, surrounded by the ghosts of everyone he had once loved and then destroyed, Curtis accepted that as the natural consequence of living in a world where betrayal was rewarded with annihilation. As the sun set over the city he had conquered and defended, Curtis Hicks smiled the cold smile of a man who had faced the worst that life could offer and emerged victorious. He had learned the most important lesson of all. In a world full of enemies and traitors, the only person you could truly trust was yourself. The reckoning was complete, and Curtis Hicks stood alone at the center of his empire, exactly as he had planned. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Edmund Weston had built his empire from nothing. Starting as a construction worker in Detroit, he'd clawed his way up through sheer determination and an unwavering code. Loyalty above all else. By 42, he owned Weston Construction, the largest infrastructure company in the Midwest, with contracts spanning 3 states. His weathered hands told the story of a man who'd never forgotten where he came from, even as his bank account grew into 8 figures. The cornerstone of Edmund's life was his family. He'd married Renee Burke 20 years ago, a radiant woman with auburn hair and emerald eyes who'd captured his heart at a construction site charity event. She'd been volunteering, serving coffee to workers, and Edmund had been struck not just by her beauty, but by her genuine warmth toward the blue-collar men others might have overlooked. Their son, Troy Weston, now 19, was everything Edmund had hoped for in an heir. Sharp-minded, respectful, and showing genuine interest in the family business. Troy had just completed his freshman year at Michigan State, studying civil engineering. During summers, he worked construction sites, earning the respect of Edmund's crew through sweat and competence rather than nepotism. Renee's sister, Cheryl Marshall, had always been the family's wild card. 3 years younger than Renee, she drifted through life on her looks and charm, never quite settling into anything substantial. Her engagement to Scott Dawson, a smooth-talking real estate developer, had been announced 6 months ago, much to Edmund's private skepticism. There was something about Scott's too-perfect smile and his habit of avoiding direct eye contact that set Edmund's instincts on edge. The Weston household was a testament to Edmund's success and values. Their sprawling home in Bloomfield Hills sat on 5 acres, with a workshop where Edmund still tinkered with engines and taught Troy the fundamentals of machinery. Family dinners were sacred, phones put away, conversation flowing easily between construction site stories and Troy's college experiences. But beneath the surface of this American dream, cracks were forming that Edmund couldn't yet see. Renee had been distant lately, claiming stress from planning Cheryl's engagement party. She'd been taking more spa days, more shopping trips, more time away from the family rhythm that had defined their marriage. When Edmund mentioned it, she'd smile and deflect, talking about how she deserved to enjoy the fruits of his labor. The engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday in late September, with Scott's family flying in from California. Edmund had insisted on hosting it at their home, despite Renee's strange reluctance. "It's family," he'd said firmly. "Family celebrates together." As the party approached, Edmund noticed subtle changes in the household dynamics. Renee and Cheryl would stop conversations when he entered rooms. Phone calls would end abruptly. Most unsettling, Troy seemed to be avoiding family gatherings, claiming extra study sessions or work shifts. When Edmund pressed him, Troy would look away, mumbling something about giving the women space to plan. The night before the party, Edmund found himself in his workshop, hands busy with an engine rebuild, but his mind elsewhere. His phone buzzed with a text from his foreman. "Carlos Webb, boss, that new safety inspector's been asking questions about our permits. Seems off. Thought you should know." Edmund frowned. His company's paperwork was immaculate, but in his world, questions from strangers usually meant trouble. He made a mental note to investigate Monday morning, after the family celebration ended. He had no idea that by Monday morning, his entire world would be ash and rubble, and that Carlos's warning would prove to be the least of his concerns. Chapter 2. The Proposal Trap. The day of Cheryl's engagement party dawned crisp and clear, with autumn leaves painting the Weston property in brilliant golds and reds. Edmund had hired a catering company and set up the backyard with white tents and elegant lighting. Despite his reservations about Scott, he was determined to give Cheryl the celebration she deserved. By noon, guests began arriving. Scott's family from California seemed pleasant enough, though Edmund noticed they kept their distance from the construction workers and their families who made up Edmund's inner circle. The social divide was subtle but present, with Scott's people clustering around the bar, while Edmund's crew gravitated toward the food and lawn games. Edmund watched from the deck as Scott worked the crowd, his charm turned up to maximum. The man had perfected the art of making everyone feel like the most important person in the room, at least for the 30 seconds he spent with them. But Edmund's trained, I caught the calculation behind every smile, the way Scott's attention always drifted to whoever might be most useful to him. "You're brooding again," Renee said, appearing at his elbow with a champagne flute. She looked stunning in a navy blue dress that hugged her curves, her hair styled in an elegant updo. But there was something in her eyes Edmund couldn't quite read, a nervousness that seemed to go beyond normal party anxiety. "Just watching," Edmund replied, accepting the drink. "Making sure everyone's having a good time." "They are." Cheryl's practically glowing. Renee's voice carried a note Edmund had never heard before, almost like she was trying to convince herself of something. Troy appeared through the crowd, looking sharp in a charcoal suit, but carrying himself with unusual tension. "Dad, Carlos is here with the crew. They're asking about Monday's schedule." Edmund nodded, then paused. Something in Troy's tone was off. His son was usually direct, confident. Today he seemed almost guilty. "Tell them we'll discuss it Monday. Today's about family." As Troy melted back into the crowd, Edmund noticed him exchange a look with Renee. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Edmund had spent decades reading people, and what he saw in that glance made his blood run cold. It was the look of conspirators, of people sharing a secret. The formal proposal was scheduled for 4 p.m., with Scott having planned an elaborate speech followed by a second proposal with a new ring. Apparently, the first one hadn't been special enough for such a momentous occasion. Edmund thought it was theatrical nonsense, but he kept his opinion to himself. At 3:45, as guests gathered in the backyard, Edmund's phone rang. The caller ID showed Troy's number, which was odd since his son was supposed to be helping coordinate the proposal. Edmund stepped into his study to answer. "Dad." Troy's voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "I'm at the hospital. I've been in an accident." Edmund's world tilted. "What kind of accident? Are you hurt?" "Car accident. I'm going into surgery. They said it's serious." Troy's voice cracked. "I need you here." Edmund's training kicked in. Crisis management, clear thinking, decisive action. "I'm on my way." "Which hospital?" "Beaumont." "Dad, I'm scared." The line went dead. Edmund stared at the phone, his mind racing. Troy had been here 20 minutes ago. How had he gotten to the hospital so quickly? And why hadn't anyone else noticed he was gone? Edmund burst through the study door, scanning the crowd for Renee. He found her by the gift table, laughing with Scott's mother. When she saw his face, her smile faltered. "Renee, we need to go. Now." Troy's been in an accident. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the patio stones. But instead of the shock and panic Edmund expected, what he saw in her eyes was something else entirely. Annoyance, frustration, and then, most chilling of all, a quick glance toward Scott. "Don't call me at a time like this," she snapped, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet patio. "Today is my sister's proposal celebration." Edmund stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. Around them, the party guests had gone silent, sensing the tension. Scott appeared beside them, his arms sliding around Renee's waist in a gesture that seemed far too familiar. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime moment," Cheryl laughed, though her eyes were cold. "Stop ruining it." Edmund's gaze moved slowly from his wife to Scott, taking in the man's protective stance, the way his hand rested on Renee's hip, the guilty flush creeping up Scott's neck. The pieces clicked into place with brutal clarity. "How long?" Edmund's voice was quiet, deadly. "Edmund, please," Renee started, but Scott stepped forward. "Look, this isn't how we wanted you to find out, but..." The rest of Scott's words were lost as Edmund's fist connected with his jaw. Scott dropped like a stone, blood streaming from his split lip. Cheryl screamed. Guests scattered, and somewhere in the chaos, Edmund heard his phone ringing again. With shaking hands, he answered. "Troy, Dad, where are you?" "The surgery. They need consent forms signed." "I'm scared." Edmund looked at his wife, at her lover bleeding on the patio stones, at the wreckage of his family celebration. "I'm coming, son. Daddy's coming." As he walked toward his truck, Carlos Webb stepped into his path. Boss, you need to know. The kid. Troy's been covering for them. He's been their lookout, their alibi. I'm sorry, but you needed to know. Edmund stopped walking. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. Troy's strange behavior, his avoidance, his guilt. His own son had been part of this betrayal. Thank you, Carlos, Edmund said quietly. Take care of the guests. Tell them the party's over. As he drove toward the hospital, Edmund's mind was already working, calculating, planning. He'd built an empire by being smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than anyone who tried to cross him. Now, for the first time in 20 years, someone had betrayed him. Multiple someones. People he'd trusted with his heart, his home, his legacy. They had no idea what they'd awakened. Chapter 3. The Emergency Room Revelation. Beaumont Hospital's emergency room was a maze of harsh fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells. Edmund's boots echoed against the polished floors as he strode toward the reception desk, his mind still reeling from the afternoon's revelations. The nurse, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, looked up from her computer. I'm looking for Troy Weston. Car accident victim, supposed to be in surgery. She typed rapidly, frowned, typed again. Sir, I'm not showing any patient by that name. Are you sure about the hospital? Edmund's blood went cold. Check again. Troy Weston, 19 years old. He called me from here. After several more minutes of searching, the nurse shook her head. I'm sorry, sir. No one by that name has been admitted today. Are you sure he said Beaumont? Edmund's phone buzzed. A text from Troy. Dad, where are you? Surgery starting soon. Room 314. He showed the message to the nurse. She looked confused. Sir, room 314 is a storage closet. We don't have patient rooms numbered in the 300s. The realization hit Edmund like a physical blow. He'd been played. Completely, thoroughly played. His own son had lured him away from the house with a fake emergency, giving Renee and Scott the perfect cover for their affair to come to light during the chaos of the party. Edmund's hand shook as he dialed Troy's number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. The phone had been turned off. Sir, are you all right? The nurse asked, genuine concern in her voice. I'm fine. Edmund lied, his voice barely recognizable. Just a misunderstanding. The drive back to Bloomfield Hills felt like a journey through hell. Edmund's mind raced through the implications. This wasn't just an affair. It was a coordinated betrayal involving his wife, her lover, and his own son. The fake emergency had been elaborately planned, complete with props and timing designed to maximum emotional impact. As he pulled into his driveway, Edmund saw that most of the guests had left. A few stragglers remained, helping with cleanup, but the celebration was clearly over. Carlos Webb approached the truck as Edmund got out. Boss, after you left, things got interesting. Scott's been making calls, and I caught some of what he said. Something about Phase 2 and the timeline moving up. Thought you should know. Edmund nodded grimly. Carlos, I need you to do something for me. Quietly. I need surveillance on this house. Cameras, audio, the works. Can you handle that? Already on it, boss. Had a feeling something was off. The equipment will be installed tomorrow while you're at the office. Edmund clasped his foreman's shoulder. Thank you. And Carlos? Not a word to anyone. Not even the crew. You got it, boss. Just be careful. Whatever's going on here, it's bigger than just an affair. Inside the house, Edmund found the aftermath of the party. Renee was in the kitchen, mechanically loading dishes into the dishwasher. She looked up when he entered, her face pale but defiant. Is Troy okay? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. You tell me, Renee. You seem to know more about my son's whereabouts than I do. She turned back to the dishes, avoiding his eyes. I don't know what you mean. The hospital had no record of him. Room 314 is a storage closet. He played me, and you knew it. Renee's hands stilled on the plates. When she turned around, the mask had finally slipped. The woman he'd loved for 20 years was gone, replaced by someone cold and calculating. Edmund, you have to understand. I understand perfectly. My wife, my son, and my soon-to-be brother-in-law have been planning this for months. The only question is why. Before Renee could answer, the front door opened. Scott walked in, his jaw swollen and a butterfly bandage over his split lip. Behind him came Troy, looking sullen and avoiding eye contact. Dad, Troy started, but Edmund held up a hand. Don't. Just don't. Edmund studied his son's face, looking for any trace of the boy he'd raised, the young man he'd been so proud of. What he saw instead was a stranger, someone who'd learned to lie with practiced ease, who'd betrayed his own father without apparent remorse. How long have you been part of this? Edmund asked quietly. Troy's jaw tightened. It's not what you think. Then explain it to me. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Scott stepped forward, his voice slightly slurred from his swollen jaw. Edmund, we need to talk. All of us. There are things you don't understand about your family, about your business, about a lot of things. Edmund's laugh was bitter. Oh, I think I understand plenty. My wife's been sleeping with my future brother-in-law, and my son's been helping them cover it up. What else is there to understand? The house, Renee said suddenly. The company, the accounts. Edmund, you're going to lose everything anyway. We were trying to save what we could. Edmund felt the world tilt again. What are you talking about? Scott pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like legal documents. Those permits Carlos mentioned? They're fraudulent. The safety violations on your job sites? They're real. The state's been building a case against Weston Construction for months. By next week, you'll be facing federal charges. The room spun. Edmund gripped the counter for support. That's impossible. I run a clean operation. No, you don't, Troy said, his voice barely above a whisper. You just thought you did. Scott's been helping me understand how the business really works. The shortcuts, the bribes, the safety violations. It's all going to come out. Edmund stared at his son, seeing the truth in his eyes. Not just betrayal, but something worse. Troy actually believed what he was saying. He'd been convinced that his father was a criminal, that the empire Edmund had built was constructed on lies and corruption. So, you decided to what? Steal everything before I got arrested. We decided to protect what we could, Renee said, her voice strengthening. Scott has connections. He can make this go away, but only if we cooperate. Edmund's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but not in the way his family thought. This wasn't just about an affair or even about framing him for crimes. This was about something much bigger, much more carefully planned. And what does Scott get out of this generous offer? Scott's smile was cold. A successful construction company, a beautiful wife, a stepson who respects him. Everything you're about to lose. Edmund nodded slowly, as if considering. I see. And you really think the state has a case against me? We know they do, Troy said. I've seen the evidence. Scott showed me. Show me. For the next hour, Edmund listened as his family laid out their case against him. Falsified permits, ignored safety violations, bribed inspectors. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, and completely fabricated. But it was also extremely well done, professional enough to fool investigators and family members alike. As Scott spoke, Edmund noticed something the others had missed. Every piece of evidence could be traced back to Scott himself. The man had spent months creating an elaborate frame job, convincing Troy that his father was a criminal while simultaneously seducing his wife and positioning himself to take over everything Edmund had built. This is very thorough, Edmund said finally. Very impressive work. Scott preened. I've been working on it for almost a year. The state investigators I've been feeding information to are completely convinced. And they're going to arrest me when? Monday morning. Unless you sign these papers tonight. Scott slid a stack of documents across the counter. Transfer of business assets, property deeds, bank account authorizations. Sign these, and I can make the charges disappear. Edmund picked up the papers, scanning them carefully. It was all there, a complete transfer of his life's work to Scott Dawson, with Renee and Troy as beneficiaries. In exchange, Scott would use his connections to make the criminal charges vanish. What happens to me? You disappear, Renee said, not meeting his eyes. Scott has a place in Mexico. You can start over there. And if I refuse, then you go to prison for 20 years, Troy said, his voice cracking slightly. Dad, please. This is the only way. Edmund set down the papers and looked at each of them in turn. His wife, his son, and the man who'd orchestrated it all. They were waiting for his answer, confident that they'd backed him into a corner with no escape. They had no idea that Edmund Weston had been fighting his way out of corners his entire life, and that he'd never lost a battle that truly mattered. "I need time to think," he said finally. "You have until midnight," Scott said. "After that, the offer expires and the charges get filed." Edmund nodded. "Then I guess I'd better get thinking." As he walked toward his study, Edmund caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. The man staring back looked older, tired, defeated. But behind his eyes, something was stirring. Something dark and patient and utterly ruthless. Scott Dawson thought he was the predator in this scenario. He was about to learn what it meant to be prey. Chapter 4. The Architect of Destruction. Edmund sat in his study, surrounded by 20 years of memories and achievements. Awards lined the walls, photos of construction sites, and ribbon cuttings documenting his rise from nothing to everything. On his desk lay Scott's papers, the instruments of his supposed surrender. But Edmund Weston had not built an empire by surrendering. He opened his laptop and began to type, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, he had Carlos Webb on a secure video call. "Carlos, I need you to listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this conversation." "You got it, boss." "Scott Dawson has been systematically framing me for crimes I didn't commit. He's got forged documents, fabricated evidence, the works. But more than that, he's convinced my family that I'm guilty." Carlos's face darkened. "That son of a bitch. What do you need?" "I need you to contact Detective Adrian Dunn at the state police. You remember him from the charity poker games? Tell him I have information about a conspiracy to defraud the state investigation unit. But don't mention Scott's name yet. I want to control how this unfolds. Consider it done. What else? The surveillance equipment you mentioned, I need it installed tonight. And I need you to gather the crew. The loyal ones. The ones who've been with me since the beginning. We're going to need them." After ending the call, Edmund opened his safe and retrieved a file he'd hoped never to use. Inside were background checks on everyone in his inner circle, family, employees, contractors. He'd learned long ago that in business, information was the ultimate weapon. Scott Dawson's file was thin but revealing. Born in San Francisco, moved to Detroit 6 months ago, officially a real estate developer, but with no significant projects to his name. What was interesting was what wasn't there: no long-term employment history, no substantial assets, no deep local connections. Scott was exactly what he appeared to be, a professional con man. But the real revelation came when Edmund cross-referenced Scott's arrival in Detroit with a timeline of his family's behavioral changes. Scott had been working on this scheme for almost a year, carefully cultivating relationships, gathering information, positioning himself for the kill. Edmund's phone buzzed. A text from Detective Dunn. "Got your message. Can you meet tonight? This sounds serious." Edmund smiled for the first time in hours. "Warehouse on Miller Road. Midnight." As he prepared to leave, Edmund made one more call. This one to his lawyer, Aaron Connor, a sharp-eyed man who'd handled the company's legal affairs for a decade. "Aaron, I need you to do something off the books. I'm going to send you some documents. I want you to examine them and tell me how they were fabricated. Don't worry about the legal implications. Just focus on the technical aspects." "Edmund, what's going on?" "Someone's trying to frame me. I need to know how they did it so I can prove it." Within an hour, Aaron called back. "Edmund, these documents are good. Really good. Whoever made them had access to state database systems, official letterhead, even internal case numbers. This is an amateur hour. Could Scott Dawson have done this alone? No way. He'd need help from someone inside the system. Someone with access to real case files and the ability to manipulate records." Edmund nodded. "Keep digging. I'll be in touch." At 11:30 p.m., Edmund arrived at the warehouse where he'd started his business 20 years ago. The building was dark, empty, but it held memories of every success and failure that had brought him to this moment. At exactly midnight, headlights swept across the parking lot. Detective Adrian Dunn stepped out of an unmarked police car, his face grave. "Edmund, Carlos, fill me in on some of this. What exactly are we dealing with?" Edmund handed him copies of Scott's fabricated evidence. "Someone's been feeding your department false information about my company. I think they're planning to use fake charges to force me out of business." Dunn examined the documents under a flashlight. "Jesus, These look official. If someone brought these to me, I'd have no reason to doubt them. That's the point. But look at this. Edmund pointed to a date stamp on one of the permits. This is supposed to be from last March, but the serial number format wasn't implemented until June. Whoever made this was working from outdated templates. Dunn's eyes sharpened. You think this Scott Dawson is behind it? I know he is, but he's not working alone. He has someone inside your department helping him. That's a serious accusation. I'm not making accusations. I'm offering to help you catch them. For the next hour, Edmund and Dunn worked through the evidence, identifying inconsistencies and impossible timelines. By 1 a.m., they had a clear picture of the conspiracy. I need you to do something for me, Edmund said. I need you to pretend to go along with this. Let Scott think his plan is working. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that if we're patient, we can catch him in the act. But I need time to set things up on my end. Dunn nodded. How long? Give me a week. Maybe 2. Can you stall any official investigation that long? For an old friend? I can manage it. As they parted ways, Edmund felt the familiar satisfaction of a plan coming together. Scott thought he was the puppet master, but he was about to learn that Edmund Weston played chess while others played checkers. Driving home, Edmund's phone rang. It was Troy. Dad, we need to talk. I've been thinking about what Scott said, and Not over the phone. Edmund cut him off. Meet me at the office tomorrow. Just you and me. Dad, I'm sorry. I really thought. Tomorrow, Troy. We'll talk tomorrow. As Edmund pulled into his driveway, he saw that the lights were still on in the house. Through the window, he could see Renee and Scott sitting close together on the couch, probably planning their next move. But thanks to Carlos's surveillance equipment, their planning session would be recorded. Edmund parked and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. In less than 24 hours, his world had been turned upside down. But he'd survived worse. He'd built something from nothing once before, and if necessary, he'd do it again. But first, he was going to destroy everyone who'd betrayed him. Methodically, completely, and without mercy. As he walked toward the house, Edmund Weston began to smile. The game was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Son's Confession. The next morning, Edmund arrived at his office before dawn. The Weston Construction headquarters occupied 3 floors of a downtown Detroit high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city Edmund had helped rebuild. He'd always found peace in the early morning quiet, the sense of potential that came with each new day. Today, that peace was shattered. Troy was waiting in the lobby, looking haggard and younger than his 19 years. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd spent the night wrestling with his conscience. "Dad," he said, standing as Edmund approached. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Edmund gestured toward the elevator. "Let's go upstairs." In his office, Edmund poured coffee from the machine his secretary kept stocked. He offered a cup to Troy, who shook his head. "I can't. I haven't been sleeping. Haven't been eating much either." Edmund settled behind his desk, studying his son's face. "So talk." Troy's words came out in a rush. "Dad, I need you to know that I never meant for it to go this far. When Scott first approached me, he said he was just concerned about Mom. He said she seemed unhappy, that maybe you and her needed to work things out. When did he first approach you?" "Last Christmas. He said he was worried about the family, about how hard you were working. He seemed to really care about Mom's happiness." Edmund nodded, his face impassive. "Go on." He started asking questions about the business. Nothing that seemed suspicious at first, just general stuff about construction, about how the company operated. He said he might want to invest, maybe partner with you on some projects. "And you told him about company operations?" Troy shifted uncomfortably. "Not sensitive stuff, just general things. How he bid on jobs, how he managed projects. He was going to be family, Dad. I thought it was okay." Edmund's jaw tightened. "When did it change?" "A few months ago. He started showing me documents, evidence he said he'd found about safety violations, permit issues. He said he was trying to protect the family from what was coming." "And you believed him?" Troy's voice cracked. "He had official documents, Dad. State letterhead, case numbers, everything. He said there was going to be an investigation, that you could go to prison. He said the only way to save the family was to cooperate." Edmund leaned forward. "Cooperate how?" He needed access to company files, financial records, employee information. He said he was building a defense, finding ways to minimize the damage. I gave him my access codes. The admission hung in the air between them. Edmund felt a cold rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. What else? He needed alibis. Times when Mom could meet with lawyers, when they could work on the defense without you knowing. He said it was important to keep you out of it until they had a strategy. So you provided cover for their affair. Troy's face crumpled. I didn't know it was an affair. I swear, Dad. I thought they were working together to save the family. When I found out about them, it was too late. Scott said if I backed out now, you'd definitely go to prison. Edmund stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Troy, I need you to understand something. There is no state investigation. The documents Scott showed you were fabricated. The evidence was fake. All of it. But you saw what he wanted you to see. Scott Dawson is a con man. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. He used your love for this family to turn you against me. Troy was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting everyone. I know you did. Edmund turned back to his son. But thinking isn't enough. You gave him everything he needed to destroy me. Company secrets, financial information, access to our systems. Do you understand what that means? Troy nodded miserably. I've ruined everything. Yes, you have. Edmund's voice was cold, final. But more than that, you chose to believe a stranger over your own father. You chose to trust someone you'd known for months over the man who raised you. Dad, please. I'm not finished. Edmund's tone cut through Troy's plea. You didn't just betray me, Troy. You betrayed everyone who depends on this company. Carlos, who's worked for me for 15 years. The crews who trust me to keep them employed. The families who depend on us for their livelihoods. You were willing to sacrifice all of them based on the word of con man. Troy was crying now, tears streaming down his face. I can fix this. I can help you stop him. Can you? Or will you just find another reason to doubt me when things get difficult? I won't. I promise. Edmund walked around the desk and stood in front of his son. Troy, I've spent my life building something worth passing down to you. I've worked 18-hour days, sacrificed time with family, made enemies and allies, also that someday you could inherit something meaningful. I know, Dad. I know. No, you don't. Because if you really understood what this company represents, what it means to the people who work here, you never would have betrayed it. You never would have betrayed me. Troy looked up at his father, desperation in his eyes. What can I do? How can I make this right? Edmund was quiet for a long moment. You can start by telling me everything. Every conversation with Scott, every piece of information you gave him, every lie you told on his behalf. Everything. For the next 2 hours, Troy talked. He detailed Scott's patient manipulation, the way the con man had gradually built trust before making larger and larger requests. He described the fake documents, the manufactured urgency, the careful way Scott had isolated him from his father while making him complicit in the scheme. When Troy finished, Edmund had a complete picture of Scott's operation. It was even more sophisticated than he'd realized, with multiple layers of deception and manipulation. But it was also built on a foundation of lies that could be systematically exposed. Dad, Troy said finally, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I've broken something between us that can't be fixed. But please, let me help you stop him. Edmund studied his son's face, seeing the genuine remorse and desperation there. Part of him wanted to forgive, to rebuild the relationship that had been so important to both of them. But a larger part of him, the part that had built an empire through ruthless pragmatism, saw only weakness and betrayal. You want to help? Edmund asked. Yes, anything. Then you're going to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, without question or hesitation. You're going to help me destroy Scott Dawson and everyone who helped him, including your mother. Troy flinched. Dad, Mom was manipulated too. She's as much a victim as... Your mother is a grown woman who made her choices. She chose to believe Scott over me, just like you did. She chose to plan my destruction, just like you did. And she chose to betray 20 years of marriage for a con man she'd known for less than a year. But, no, but's Troy. You forfeited the right to defend her when you became part of this. You either help me completely, or you get out of my sight and never come back. Troy stared at his father, seeing a coldness there he'd never witnessed before. This wasn't the man who'd taught him to drive, who'd worked beside him on construction sites, who'd been proud of his college grades. This was someone harder, more dangerous. I'll help, Troy whispered. Good. Because what comes next is going to require both of us to do things we never thought we'd do. And when it's over, Scott Dawson is going to wish he'd never heard the name Weston. Edmund walked back to his desk and began making notes. First, you're going to go home and act like nothing's changed. You're going to keep Scott thinking you're on his side. But everything he says, everything he does, you're going to report back to me. Okay. Second, you're going to help me set a trap. Scott thinks he's won, but he's about to learn that I don't lose. Ever. Troy nodded, wiping his eyes. What do you need me to do? Edmund pulled out his phone and showed Troy a text message. Tonight, Scott's going to receive some very interesting information about offshore accounts and hidden assets. Information that will make him think he's found the mother lode. But it's fake. It's bait. And your job is to make sure he takes it. As Troy left the office, Edmund felt the familiar satisfaction of pieces falling into place. Scott had spent months manipulating his family, but Edmund was about to turn that manipulation back on itself. The game was entering its second phase, and Edmund Weston always played to win. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. 3 days after Troy's confession, Edmund watched from his study as Scott paced in the living room below, his phone pressed to his ear. The surveillance equipment Carlos had installed was working perfectly, capturing every word of Scott's increasingly frantic conversations. No, the timeline has to move up, Scott was saying to someone on the other end. He's getting suspicious. We need to finalize everything tonight. Edmund smiled coldly. Scott had no idea how suspicious Edmund actually was, or how thoroughly his plan had been compromised. For the past 72 hours, Edmund had been feeding Scott carefully crafted misinformation through Troy, each piece designed to make the con man overconfident and reckless. The crown jewel had been the discovery of Edmund's supposed offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Troy had accidentally let slip that his father kept detailed financial records in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. The information was completely fabricated, but Scott had bought it completely. Edmund's phone buzzed. A text from Detective Dunn. Your friend took the bait. He just contacted our insider asking for help accessing federal banking records. We've got him on wire fraud now. The insider Dunn referenced was Detective Marcella Stark, a longtime member of the Financial Crimes Unit who'd been feeding Scott information for months. What Scott didn't know was that Stark had been under internal investigation for corruption, and Dunn had flipped her weeks ago. Every piece of evidence Scott thought he was getting from inside the police department was actually being carefully orchestrated by Edmund and Dunn. Edmund walked downstairs, timing his entrance perfectly. Scott was just ending his call, his face flushed with excitement. Edmund, Scott said, trying to look casual. I was just checking with my contact at the state. The investigation is moving faster than expected. We really need those documents signed tonight. I've been thinking about your offer, Edmund said carefully. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time for me to step aside. Scott's eyes lit up. You're making the right choice. For everyone involved. But I have conditions. Scott's smile faltered slightly. What kind of conditions? I want guarantees, legal protections, and I want to make sure my legitimate assets are protected before I sign anything over. Of course. What did you have in mind? Edmund pulled out a folder he'd prepared. I have some investments and accounts that need to be transferred properly. Offshore holdings, that kind of thing. I need to make sure they're handled correctly before I disappear. Scott's predatory instincts took over. Offshore accounts? How much are we talking about? Enough to make retirement comfortable, but I'll need help accessing them. The paperwork is complex, and I'll need someone I trust to handle the transfers. I could help with that, Scott said eagerly. I have experience with international banking. I was hoping you'd say that. Edmund handed him the folder. These are the account details. But Edmund, this has to stay between us. If Renee finds out about these accounts, she won't hear it from me, Scott assured him, already leafing through the fabricated documents. This is substantial, Edmund. 20 years of careful investment. I'd hate to see it all disappear into government seizures. Scott's mind was clearly racing, calculating percentages and possibilities. When do you need this handled? Tomorrow. The banks close early on Fridays, so if we're going to do this, it has to be then. Consider done. Scott was practically salivating. And Edmund? You're making the smart choice. This way, everyone wins. As Scott hurried upstairs to share the news with Renee, Edmund allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Greed was such a predictable weakness, and Scott had just walked into a trap that would destroy him completely. Edmund's phone rang. Carlos Webb's name appeared on the screen. Boss, the team is in position. Dunn's people are ready to move. You sure about the timing? Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Scott will be at First National Bank trying to access accounts that don't exist. When he attempts to use forged federal banking credentials, they'll have him cold. And the wife. Edmund's expression hardened. Renee will be dealt with separately. I have something special planned for her. Boss, I gotta ask, what about Troy? He's been helping us, but Troy made his choice when he betrayed this family. There are consequences for that. Edmund ended the call and walked to his safe, retrieving a thick manila envelope. Inside were documents that would reshape his family's future. A revised will, updated business partnerships, and several other legal instruments that would ensure his legacy survived even if he didn't. Upstairs, he could hear Renee and Scott celebrating what they thought was their imminent victory. They had no idea that tomorrow would bring not wealth and freedom, but handcuffs and federal charges. Edmund poured himself a whiskey and sat in his favorite chair, looking out at the property he'd built with his own hands. By this time tomorrow, the people who'd betrayed him would understand what it meant to cross Edmund Weston. The phone rang again. This time it was Troy. Dad, Scott's really excited about something. He's been making calls all evening about bank transfers and account access. He thinks he's found some kind of jackpot. Good. That means he's walking into the trap exactly as planned. Dad, I need to ask you something. After this is over, after Scott's arrested, what happens to us? To our family? Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Troy, there is no family anymore. You made sure of that when you chose to trust a stranger over your father. But I'm helping now. I'm trying to make it right. You're helping because you got caught. You're helping because you finally realized that Scott was using you. But you didn't come to me out of loyalty or love, Troy. You came to me out of fear. That's not true. It is true, and it's why, after tomorrow, you're going to leave. You're going to start over somewhere else, build your own life, make your own way. The Weston name and the Weston legacy are no longer yours to inherit. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. When Troy finally spoke, his voice was broken. Dad, please. I know I messed up, but I'm still your son. No, Edmund said quietly. My son would never have betrayed me. My son would have come to me with questions instead of conspiring behind my back. My son would have chosen family over the lies of a con man. I can change. I can prove myself to you. The time for proving yourself was months ago, when Scott first approached you. You failed that test, Troy. And in my world, there are no second chances for betrayal. Edmund ended the call and turned off his phone. Tomorrow would bring justice for Scott and Renee, but it would also mark the end of the family Edmund had spent 20 years building. As he sat in the darkness, Edmund Weston began planning for a future that would be built on the ashes of the past. He'd lost a wife and a son, but he'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that he was strong enough to survive anything, even the betrayal of those he loved most. The final act was about to begin. Chapter 7. The Bank Job. Friday morning dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over Detroit. Edmund stood at his office window, watching the city wake up below him. Today would change everything, and he wanted to remember this moment, the calm before the storm he was about to unleash. At exactly 10 a.m., his phone rang. Detective Dunn's voice was tense with anticipation. Edmund, everything's in place. Our people are positioned at the bank, and we've got surveillance on Scott's location. Marcella Stark is ready to play her part. What about the federal banking credentials? Scott requested them from Stark an hour ago. She provided him with fake FBI credentials that will trigger federal charges the moment he uses them. We've got him on wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Edmund nodded. And Renee? That's your call. We don't have enough evidence to charge her with anything criminal, but leave Renee to me. I have my own plans for her. At 11:30, Edmund watched through his surveillance feed as Scott prepared to leave the house. The man was dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase that Edmund knew contained forged documents and fake credentials. Scott looked confident, even excited, as he kissed Renee goodbye. "Wish me luck, baby," Scott said. "By tonight, we'll be rich beyond our wildest dreams." "Be careful," Renee replied, but Edmund could see the greed in her eyes. She was just as guilty as Scott, just as eager to profit from Edmund's destruction. Edmund left his office at noon, driving slowly through the city toward First National Bank. He wanted to be there to watch Scott's world collapse in real time. The bank's main branch was a marble and glass monument to financial security, with high ceilings and an atmosphere of quiet prosperity. Edmund positioned himself at a coffee shop across the street, where he had a clear view of the entrance. At 1:45 p.m., Scott arrived in a rented BMW, looking every inch the successful businessman. He strode into the bank with the confidence of a man who believed he was about to score the biggest con of his career. Edmund's phone buzzed with updates from Detective Dunn. 1:47 p.m., subject has approached customer service desk. 1:52 p.m., subject is being directed to safety deposit box area. 1:58 p.m., subject is presenting credentials to bank security. 2:03 p.m., federal agents moving in. Through the bank's glass windows, Edmund watched as FBI agents in bulletproof vests surrounded Scott at the security desk. The con man's face went from confusion to panic to rage in the space of seconds. He tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Edmund's phone rang. Detective Dunn's voice was triumphant. "We got him, Edmund. Wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted access to federal banking systems with false credentials. He's looking at 20 years minimum. What about his inside contact? Marcella Stark is already in custody. Turns out she was selling information to other criminals, too. She'll be lucky to see the outside of a prison cell before she's 60. Edmund watched as Scott was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled, his arrogant confidence completely shattered. The con man who'd thought he could destroy Edmund Weston had just learned a hard lesson about underestimating his targets. But Scott's arrest was only the beginning. Edmund drove home through the storm that had been threatening all day. Rain lashed his windshield as he pulled into his driveway, and lightning illuminated the house, where his wife was probably celebrating her premature victory. Inside, he found Renee in the living room, pacing nervously and checking her phone every few seconds. "Edmund, thank God you're home. Scott went to handle some business this afternoon, and I haven't heard from him. I'm starting to worry." Edmund hung up his coat and walked to the bar, pouring himself a scotch. "I wouldn't worry about Scott anymore, Renee." "What do you mean?" "I mean Scott Dawson is currently in federal custody, charged with wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. He'll be spending the next 20 years in prison." Renee's face went white. "That's impossible. You're lying." Edmund pulled out his phone and showed her a news article that had already been posted online. Local real estate developer arrested in banking fraud scheme. Renee sank into a chair, her hands shaking. "How did you know?" "I knew because I set him up. Every piece of information he thought he was getting from inside sources, every document he thought proved my guilt, every offshore account he thought he discovered. It was all fake, all designed to lead him into a trap." "But Troy said—" "Troy told you what I wanted him to tell you. My son may have betrayed me initially, but he's been working for me for the past week. Every conversation you and Scott had was recorded. Every plan you made was reported back to me." Renee stared at him in shock. "You've been playing us. I've been destroying you. Systematically, completely, and without mercy." Edmund's voice was cold as winter steel. Scott thought he was the predator, but he was just another mark. And you, Renee, were just another accomplice in his scheme. "Edmund, please. I can explain." "Explain what?" "How you threw away 20 years of marriage for a con man. How you were willing to destroy everything I built because you thought you'd found something better." Renee's composure finally cracked. You don't understand. Scott made me feel alive again. He made me feel wanted, desired. When was the last time you looked at me the way he did? When was the last time you deserved to be looked at that way? Edmund's words hit like physical blows. You want to know the truth, Renee? Scott didn't desire you. He was using you, just like he used Troy, just like he tried to use me. You were just another tool in his con game. That's not true. Edmund pulled out a tablet and played a recording from their surveillance system. Scott's voice filled the room, speaking to someone on the phone. The wife is completely under control. She actually thinks I love her. It's pathetic, really, but she's useful for getting information and keeping the husband distracted. Once I have control of the company, I'll dump her and disappear with the money. Renee listened to the recording with growing horror, tears streaming down her face. He said he loved me. He said what he needed to say to manipulate you. Just like you said what you needed to say to betray me. Edmund finished his scotch and set the glass down with finality. Pack your things, Renee. You have until tomorrow morning to get out of my house. Where am I supposed to go? I don't have anywhere. That's not my problem anymore. You made your choice when you decided to destroy our marriage. Now you get to live with the consequences. What about the divorce? What about my share of? What share? Edmund's laugh was bitter. You conspired to defraud me, Renee. You participated in a criminal enterprise designed to steal everything I've worked for. Any competent lawyer will advise you to take whatever settlement I offer and be grateful you're not in prison alongside your boyfriend. Renee sobbed openly now, the full weight of her situation finally sinking in. Edmund, please. I made a mistake, but we can work through this. We can go to counseling, start over. There is no starting over. There is no working through this. You betrayed me. You betrayed our marriage. And you betrayed everything I thought we had together. Edmund's voice was final, implacable. You're dead to me, Renee. Just like Scott is dead to me. Just like Troy is dead to me. Troy? What about Troy? Troy made his choice when he decided to help Scott destroy me. He's no longer my son, and he's no longer welcome in this family. Edmund walked toward the stairs, then paused. One more thing, Renee. If you try to take anything that isn't yours, if you make any public statements about our marriage or my business, if you cause any problems whatsoever, I will make your life a living hell. Scott thought he was ruthless, but he was just an amateur compared to what I'm capable of when someone betrays me. As Edmund climbed the stairs to his bedroom, Renee's sobs echoed through the house. But he felt no sympathy, no regret, no second thoughts. She had chosen her path, and now she would walk it alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and a new life built on the ashes of the old one. Edmund Weston had lost a family, but he'd proven something more important. He was a survivor, and he was not a man to be underestimated. The reckoning was almost complete. Chapter 8. The Final Judgment. 6 months later, Edmund stood in the courthouse parking lot, watching as Troy emerged from the building with his public defender. His son, former son, Edmund corrected himself, looked thinner, older, wearing an ill-fitting suit that spoke to his changed circumstances. Troy had been charged as an accessory to Scott's fraud scheme. While the prosecutors had shown some mercy due to his cooperation and his status as a victim of manipulation, he still faced federal charges that would likely result in prison time. Edmund had not testified on his behalf. As Troy walked past Edmund's truck, their eyes met for a moment. Troy's face was a map of regret and desperation, but Edmund felt nothing. The boy who'd sat in construction sites with him, who'd learned to drive in this very parking lot, who'd made him proud at high school graduation. That boy was gone, replaced by a stranger who'd chosen betrayal over loyalty. Troy stopped walking and approached the truck. "Dad, I'm not your father anymore, Troy. We established that months ago. Please, I know you're angry, but I'm facing 5 years in federal prison. 5 years of my life gone because I trusted the wrong person. You're facing 5 years because you betrayed your family. The person you trusted was irrelevant. You chose to trust him over me." Troy's voice cracked. "I was 19 years old. I made a mistake. You made a choice. And choices have consequences." Edmund started his truck, but Troy moved to block his path. What happened to forgiveness? What happened to family loyalty? You always taught me that family comes first. I did teach you that. and you threw it back in my face the moment someone offered you what seemed like a better deal. I thought I was protecting everyone. Edmund's eyes were cold as winter ice. You thought you were protecting everyone except the one person who'd actually earned your loyalty. You were willing to believe I was a criminal, Troy. You were willing to see me destroyed based on fabricated evidence and the word of a con man you'd known for less than a year. I see that now. I understand what I did wrong. Do you? Because from where I sit, you understand that you got caught. You understand that your scheme failed, and now you're facing consequences. But I don't think you truly understand the depth of your betrayal. Troy was crying now, something Edmund would have once found heartbreaking. Now it just seemed pathetic. What can I do? What would it take for you to forgive me? Edmund considered the question seriously. Nothing. There is nothing you can do, Troy. You crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. You proved that your loyalty can be bought, that your word means nothing when it's tested, that you're willing to destroy your own family if someone convinces you it's the right thing to do. That's not who I am. It's exactly who you are. And it's who you've always been. I just didn't see it before. Edmund put the truck in drive. Goodbye, Troy. Don't contact me again. As he drove away, Edmund caught sight of Troy in his rearview mirror, standing alone in the parking lot, his shoulders shaking with sobs. For just a moment, Edmund felt a flicker of the old paternal instinct. Then he remembered the betrayal, the lies, the willingness to destroy everything Edmund had built, and the feeling died. 3 blocks away, Edmund pulled into the parking lot of a small diner where Carlos Webb was waiting. His foreman slid into the passenger seat, carrying a manila folder. It's done, boss. Troy's going to prison, Scott's already there, and Renee signed the final divorce papers this morning. What did she get? Exactly what you offered. $50,000 in cash, her personal belongings, and a car. Everything else stays with you. Edmund nodded. And she signed the non-disclosure agreement. Every page. She can't talk about the marriage, the business, or anything that happened during the divorce. If she does, you get the money back, and she faces legal consequences. Good. What about Troy's legal situation? Carlos consulted his notes. His lawyer's trying to work out a plea deal. Probably looking at 3 years if he cooperates fully with the federal investigation into Scott's other schemes. Other schemes? Turns out Scott was running similar cons in 4 other cities before he came to Detroit. The FBI thinks there might be a dozen victims across the country. Troy's testimony could help convict him on multiple counts. Edmund smiled grimly. At least Troy's betrayal will serve some useful purpose. Boss, can I ask you something? Shoot. Do you ever think about, I don't know, reconciling with the boy? I mean, he was manipulated. He was young, inexperienced. Carlos, let me ask you something. If someone came to you tomorrow with evidence that I was a criminal, would you believe them? Carlos didn't hesitate. Not for a second. Why not? Because I know you. I've worked with you for 15 years. I've seen how you treat people, how you run your business, how you handle problems. I need a hell of a lot more than some stranger's word to believe you were dirty. Exactly. Troy lived with me for 19 years. He saw how I built this company, how I treated my employees, how I handled success and failure. And despite all of that, he was willing to believe I was a criminal based on forged documents and the word of a con man. Carlos nodded slowly. That says something about his character. It says everything about his character. And that's why there's no going back. Edmund took the folder Carlos had brought and leafed through the contents. Financial statements, legal documents, business contracts, the paperwork of rebuilding a life after betrayal. What's next, boss? Next, we expand. I'm thinking about opening a branch in Florida, maybe one in Texas. Fresh markets, new opportunities. Sound good. What about here in Detroit? Detroit will always be home. But it's time to build something bigger, something that can't be destroyed by the betrayal of family members or the schemes of con men. As they sat in the diner parking lot, Edmund thought about the past 6 months. He'd lost a wife, a son, and the future he'd thought he was building. But he'd gained something too, absolute clarity about who he could trust and who he couldn't. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Dad, please. Just give me one chance to make this right. I love you. Troy. Edmund deleted the message without responding, then blocked the number. Some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. Carlos, there's something else I want you to know. What's that, boss? You, and the men who stayed loyal during all this, you're my family now. The company isn't just a business anymore. It's a legacy. And that legacy will go to people who've earned it through loyalty and hard work, not blood relations who can't be trusted. Carlos extended his hand. I'm honored, boss. We all are. Scott didn't just seduce me. He targeted me specifically, researched our marriage, our family, our weaknesses. He knew exactly what to say, exactly how to make me feel special and wanted. I was vulnerable, and he exploited that vulnerability with surgical precision. I'm not making excuses. I chose to believe his lies. I chose to betray 20 years of marriage. I chose to help him destroy the man who'd given me everything. But I want you to understand that it wasn't just an affair. It was a carefully planned manipulation designed to tear our family apart. The worst part is what he did to Troy. Our son was just a kid, Edmund, 19 years old and desperate to be accepted as a man. Scott saw that desperation and used it against him. He convinced Troy that helping him was the only way to save our family. Troy genuinely believed he was protecting us. I know you'll never forgive either of us, and I don't expect you to, but Troy is still your son, and he's suffering in ways you can't imagine. Prison destroyed him, Edmund. He came out broken, homeless, unemployable. He's been living on the streets for months, too proud to ask for help and too ashamed to face what he's become. I tried to help him, but I had nothing to give. The money you gave me is long gone, spent on lawyers and basic survival. I've been working minimum wage jobs when I could find them, living in places you wouldn't house animals. This isn't a plea for sympathy, it's just the truth. Troy came to see me last week. He looked like a ghost, Edmund. Thin, dirty, defeated. He told me he'd rather die than continue living with the guilt of what he'd done to you. I'm afraid he means it. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm asking anyway. Please don't let our son destroy himself over mistakes he made as a teenager. He was manipulated just like I was. The difference is I was old enough to know better. He wasn't. I can't live with what I've done anymore. The guilt, the shame, the knowledge that I destroyed the best thing in my life for a lie. It's too much. But maybe my death can serve a purpose. Maybe it can help you understand that Troy needs his father, even if he doesn't deserve him. I loved you, Edmund. I know you won't believe that after everything that happened, but it's true. What I felt for Scott was infatuation, manipulation, delusion. What I felt for you was real love, the kind that lasts a lifetime. I just lost sight of it when I needed it most. Please find it in your heart to forgive our son. He's paid enough for his mistakes. Goodbye, Renee. Edmund set the letter down and stared out at the city skyline. Renee was dead, his wife of 20 years, the mother of his child, the woman who'd betrayed him so completely, was gone forever. And somewhere in the city below, his son was living on the streets, broken and alone. Carlos knocked on the office door and entered cautiously. Boss, everything okay? Edmund handed him the letter. Renee's dead. Suicide. Carlos read the letter, his expression growing more troubled with each paragraph. Jesus, boss. I'm sorry. She's asking me to forgive Troy. What are you going to do? Edmund was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to do what I've always done, Carlos. I'm going to survive. I'm going to build. I'm going to prosper. And I'm going to prove that betrayal has consequences that can't be erased by guilt or regret or even death. And Troy. Edmund's voice was cold as winter steel. Troy made his choice. Renee made hers. They both chose to trust a con man over their own family. They both chose to destroy everything I'd built for them. The fact that they regretted those choices doesn't change what they did. Carlos nodded slowly. So we continue as planned. We continue as planned. The empire keeps growing, the company keeps expanding, and the people who've earned my trust keep being rewarded for their loyalty. What about the letter? What about Troy being homeless? Edmund walked to his shredder and fed Renee's letter into it, watching as her final words were cut into ribbons. What about it? He's an adult who made adult choices. If he's suffering the consequences of those choices, that's justice, not tragedy. As the last pieces of the letter disappeared, Edmund felt a sense of finality. Renee was dead, Troy was lost, and the family he'd spent decades building was gone forever. But Edmund Weston remained stronger and more successful than ever. He'd learned the most important lesson of his life. Blood meant nothing compared to loyalty, and family was something you built rather than something you inherited. The empire he'd created would outlast him, carried forward by people who'd proven their worth through dedication and trust rather than genetics and promises. And when Edmund Weston finally left this world, his legacy would be secure in hands that had earned the right to hold it. That was a victory worth more than forgiveness, more than reconciliation, more than the love of people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with it. Edmund Weston had won the only war that truly mattered, the war for his own soul, and he would never surrender it again. As they shook hands, Edmund felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. The future might be different from what he'd planned, but it would be built on a foundation of proven loyalty rather than assumed family bonds. The phone buzzed again. Another unknown number, another message from Troy. Edmund blocked it without reading and turned off his phone. The past was finished. It was time to build the future. Chapter 9. Empire Rebuilt. 2 years later, Edmund stood on the observation deck of the newly completed Weston Tower, a 40-story monument to his resilience and success. The building had risen from a downtown Detroit lot that had been empty for decades, its steel and glass reaching toward the sky like a middle finger to everyone who'd thought his downfall was permanent. The expansion into Florida and Texas had exceeded all expectations. Weston Construction now employed over 2,000 people across 3 states, with annual revenues approaching 9 figures. But more importantly, it was staffed entirely by people Edmund trusted, people who'd proven their loyalty through actions rather than words. Carlos Webb stood beside him, no longer just a foreman, but executive vice president of operations. The Houston project is ahead of schedule, and the Miami contract just came through. We're looking at another record quarter. Good. What about the Detroit City Council contracts? All approved. Mayor's singing your praises after the riverfront renovation. Says you've done more for downtown development than any other contractor in the past decade. Edmund nodded, satisfied. The riverfront project had been a gift to the city, a billion-dollar development that provided affordable housing alongside luxury condos, all designed to revitalize the neighborhoods where Edmund had grown up. It was his way of giving back to the community that had shaped him, while simultaneously proving that his empire was stronger than ever. Any word from the federal prosecutors about Scott's appeal? Denied. He's serving his full 25 years, no possibility of parole for at least 15. Turns out the judge didn't appreciate learning about his other victims during sentencing. Edmund smiled coldly. Scott Dawson had gone from thinking he was about to score millions to spending the next 2 decades in federal prison. The man who'd thought he could destroy Edmund Weston had instead become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating your mark. What about Troy's situation? Carlos's expression grew uncomfortable. He was released 6 months ago, served 18 months, got out early for good behavior and cooperation with other federal cases. And he's been trying to contact you. Letters, phone calls, showing up at job sites. The security team's been turning him away, but he's persistent. Edmund's jaw tightened. I made my position clear. Has he violated the restraining order? No, he stayed the required distance. But boss, the kid looks rough. Real rough. Prison wasn't kind to him, and he can't find work anywhere. The felony conviction has closed a lot of doors. That's not my problem. I know, but Carlos. Edmund's voice carried a warning. We've been through this. Troy made his choice. He chose to betray his family for a con man's lies. The consequences of that choice are his to bear. Carlos nodded reluctantly. Understood, boss. Edmund's phone buzzed with a text from his personal assistant. Renee Marshall requesting meeting. Says it's urgent. Edmund showed Carlos the message. Renee's been trying to contact me too. 3rd time this month. What does she want? Probably money. The $50,000 I gave her wouldn't have lasted long, and she's not exactly equipped for the real world. You gonna see her? No point. We have nothing to discuss. But even as Edmund said it, he felt a flicker of curiosity. Renee had honored the non-disclosure agreement for 2 years, never speaking publicly about their marriage or the circumstances of their divorce. For her to be reaching out now suggested something had changed. His phone rang. Detective Adrian Dunn's name appeared on the screen. Adrian, what can I do for you? Edmund, I need to give you a heads up about something. Renee Marshall was found dead in her apartment this morning. Edmund felt the words hit him like a physical blow. What happened? Apparent suicide. Pills and alcohol. She'd been dead for at least 2 days before the landlord found her. Edmund sank into a chair, the news hitting him harder than he'd expected. Any note? That's why I'm calling. She left several letters. One was addressed to you. An hour later, Edmund sat in his office, staring at an envelope with his name written in Renee's familiar handwriting. Inside was a 3-page letter that he read twice before the full impact sank in. Edmund, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know you probably won't care, and I understand why. What I did to you, to our marriage, to our family, there's no excuse for it. But I need you to know the truth before I go. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.